The frozen corpses of the early European explorers didn't freeze because they ran out of blankets. They froze because they had too many. In the late autumn of 1831, along the vast and unforgiving bends of the upper Missouri River, Silas Vance believed he had conquered the incoming winter before the first snowflake even touched the prairie. Silas was a proud, heavily built American fur trader who had spent years carving a living out of the wilderness, and he possessed a firmer, deep, unshakable confidence in his own physical strength and the material progress of his civilization. To him, survival was a matter of aggressive construction and brute force dominance over the elements, a philosophy he had fully carved into the heavy logs of his newly constructed trading post. His cabin was a monumental structure built of thick, freshly notched green pine logs, with every single seam packed tight, with wet river clay and moss to seal out the freezing air. Inside, Silas had constructed a massive stone hearth that dominated the main room, designed to burn massive logs that could throw heat across the entire space. His preparations for the winter were exhaustive and expensive, reflecting the pride of a man who believed his civilized methods were inherently superior to the ancient ways of the wilderness. Silas had stockpiled an enormous mountain of split cordwood right outside his door, stacked high and tight under a sloped wooden lean-to. He also possessed several heavy, multi-layered wool coats imported from the East, thick blankets of woven sheep's wool, and heavy, grease-treated European leather riding boots designed to block out moisture. To Silas, these heavy, rigid layers of fabric and leather were a protective shield that placed his comfort far beyond the reach of the sub-zero temperatures. He would look out across the rolling brown hills of the Missouri plains and feel a quiet satisfaction, convinced that his stout walls and massive piles of fuel would easily carry him through whatever the skies could throw at him. He believed that the local indigenous people, who lived in lightweight tippis and wore simple deer-hide clothing, were merely surviving in primitive misery because they lacked the industrial capacity to build proper, permanent houses. Silas viewed their lifestyle with a mixture of pity and arrogance, entirely confident that his massive log shield and roaring stone hearth made him impervious to the killing cold. He spent his days carrying heavy green logs into the cabin, his chest heaving under his heavy wool layers, completely satisfied with his labor. Every time he stacked another log in his main room, Silas felt the satisfaction of a man who had secured his future. He believed his physical preparation was complete, and his mind was entirely at ease as he watched the percentile's sky turn a dull gray. What he did not understand was that his thick pine logs and heavy wool blankets were not a shield, but a thermodynamic trap, and his pride was slowly sealing the lock. He had built his shelter based on the assumption that more wood, more wool, and more fire would always equal more safety. But the wilderness of the plains has a way of turning a man's own hackle, strength against him, using his heavy, sealed walls and bulky clothing to quietly dismantle his defenses from the inside out. As the late November wind began to rattle the pine needles on the ridges, Silas sat by his massive hearth, listening to the wood pop and crack, entirely unaware of the invisible flaws in his design. He had prepared for a battle of temperatures, believing that as long as his fire burned hot enough, the winter could never touch his bones. He did not know that his thick, clay-packed walls were already preparing to betray him, or that the very sweat on his skin would soon become a silent, freezing enemy. Silas simply looked out his small, oiled paper window, waiting for the winter to arrive, confident that his frontier shield would hold against the storm. A quiet rustle of leather against the doorframe was the only warning Silas Vance received before Aona stepped into the warm, smoky air of the trading post. Aona was an older Assiniboine hunter and elder, whose face was lined with the deep, weathered creases of a man who had watched 40 winters pass over the Missouri plains. He had come to the post to trade dried buffalo meat for iron, kettles, and he carried himself with an effortless, graceful poise that seemed to ignore the cold altogether. Silas immediately noticed the striking contrast between them. While Silas was dressed in bulky, heavy wool trousers and a thick, sweat-dampened flannel shirt, Aona wore only a light, single layer of smoked buckskin trousers and a soft, loose-fitting deerskin shirt. On Aona's feet were soft, flexible moccasins that conformed perfectly to his movements, allowing his toes to spread and flex naturally with every step. Silas silently judged the older hunter's attire as hopelessly primitive, wondering how a man could face the brutal Montana winds in nothing but animal skins. He watched Aona with a patronizing pity, convinced that the indigenous hunter was simply too impoverished to afford the heavy, warm woolens of the eastern traders. Silas continued his work, lifting another heavy green pine log onto his shoulder to stack it near the hearth, his muscles straining and his face flushing red as he labored in the warm cabin. Sweat pooled heavily under Silas's heavy wool collar, dampening his shirt and causing his skin to glisten in the firelight. Aona stood completely still in the center of the room, his dark, observant eyes watching the trader's frantic movements with a quiet, analytical patience. He did not speak, but his gaze lingered on the damp patches of sweat darkening Silas's woolen flannel shirt, and then shifted down to the heavy, rigid leather riding boots that Silas wore. Aona's expression was not one of anger, but of a deep, sorrowful understanding, the look of a man who had seen many proud strangers make the same fatal errors. With a slow, deliberate gesture, Aona raised his hand and lightly touched his own collar, then made a sweeping, downward motion toward the floor, silently warning Silas about the physical consequences of moisture and overexertion in a freezing environment. He was trying to show Silas that by sweating so heavily inside his heavy clothing, Silas was actively preparing his own body for a deep, inescapable chill. Silas, however, only laughed, interpreting the elder's gestures as an expression of amazement at his physical strength and the massive size of his woodpile. Silas believed his sweat was merely a sign of healthy, honest labor, and his heavy wool blankets would easily dry him once he sat down by the fire. He dismissed Aona's warning with an arrogant wave of his hand, continuing to stack his green logs with a stubborn pride. Aona watched him for a long moment, his quiet gaze taking in the heavy, airtight clay packing on the cabin walls and the massive, roaring draft of the fireplace. The Assiniboine elder knew that Silas's pride had blinded him to the basic laws of the land, and that his heavy leather boots and damp woolen shirts would soon become a heavy, frozen trap. He realized that Silas did not understand that in this wilderness, the body must breathe, and trying to dominate the cold with brute force was a guaranteed path to the grave. Without a word, Aona completed his trade, gathered his iron kettle, and stepped back out into the gathering cold, his movements light and silent as he vanished. Into the gray afternoon, Silas watched him go through the window, shaking his head at the older hunter's thin clothing and soft moccasins, entirely confident that his own heavy wool and clay-packed walls were the only true protection. He sat down by his roaring fire, feeling the heat on his face while the sweat on the sweat-on. His back slowly began to turn clammy, completely unaware that his lesson in humility had already begun. The sky finally broke on the 1st of December, dropping a bitter, freezing air, massed down from the northern ridges that locked the upper Missouri Territory in a sudden, quiet frost. The temperature plummeted rapidly throughout the afternoon, sliding far below zero before the sun had even touched the horizon, and the wind began to rise, whistling through the dry cottonwoods. Inside his stout log cabin, Silas Vance built his fire up to a roaring blaze, expecting the massive, logs to quickly drive the chill from the room. But as the external cold intensified, Silas began to experience a strange, deep-seated chill that his massive fire seemed completely unable to reach. The sweat that had pooled heavily under his wool collar and dampened his flannel shirt during his morning labor had dried into a cold, clammy film against his skin. This thin layer of moisture was now actively drawing heat from his body, replacing the warm air that should have been trapped inside his woolen fibers with a cold, conductible dampness. Silas tried pulling his heavy sheep's wool coat tighter around his shoulders, but the heavy fabric only seemed to hold the cold moisture closer to his skin, making him shiver violently even as he sat near the flames. He looked at his thermometer, confused to see that while the air temperature near his chest read a comfortable 60 degrees, his back and legs felt as though they were exposed to the freezing wind. The physical behavior of his massive stone fireplace was actually working against him. The giant fire required a massive volume of oxygen to keep burning, creating a powerful draft that sucked cold air through the tiny cracks in the cabin walls. This organized movement of air created freezing drafts at floor level, swirling around Silas's ankles and keeping his heavy leather boots icy cold while his face roasted near the hearth. Silas was forced to constantly shift his position, turning his back to the fire to warm his kidneys, while his chest began to freeze, his body caught in an exhausting cycle of uneven heating. He realized with a sudden jolt of worry that his massive woodpile, which he had expected to last until the spring thaw, was already disappearing at a terrifying rate. He had burned through more wood the last 3 days of frost than he had during the entire month of November, and the real winter storms had not even begun. Every time he opened his door to retrieve more logs. A wave of sub-zero air rushed into the cabin instantly, dropping the temperature and forcing him to build the fire even larger to compensate. Silas was caught in a reactive, exhausting cycle, his body burning precious metabolic energy just to fight the cold drafts, while his damp clothing kept him from retaining the heat his fire produced. He looked out his small window at the distant, snow-covered bluffs where Ayana's people lived in their simple typus, wondering how they could possibly survive this frost. Without a massive stone hearth and a mountain of cordwood, he believed they must be suffering terribly, huddled in their dark tents while he sat in his stout cabin. But as he looked down at his own shivering hands and damp, cold sleeves, a quiet, unsettling doubt began to take root in his mind. He realized that his stout walls and heavy blankets were not providing the simple, absolute protection he had promised himself, and his body was already beginning to feel the exhausting strain of the winter's opening move. Silas stoked the fire once more, his face burning from the heat while his back remained locked in a cold, shivering ache, his pride slowly turning into a quiet, desperate struggle for comfort. The light frost of early December soon gave way to a heavy, wet snowfall that blanketed the Missouri Valley in a deep, suffocating white. Silas Vance spent his mornings struggling through the heavy drifts, attempting to keep his woodpile clear and his livestock fed, but his heavy European gear was rapidly beginning to degrade. His thick wool coats, which he had trusted to block out the cold, absorbed the falling snow like a sponge, the moisture quickly saturating the thick fibers and mixing with the sweat from his heavy exertion. When he returned to the cabin, the heavy fabric remained damp and cold, refusing to dry fully in the humid air near the fire. Overnight, as the fire burned down and the cabin temperature dropped, Silas's wet wool coats froze solid, turning into stiff, heavy boards that stood rigid in the corner of his room. The next morning, he had to physically force his arms into the frozen sleeves, the icy wool rubbing against his skin and drawing precious heat from his body the moment he put it on. His heavy leather riding boots were even worse. The grease-treated leather had absorbed moisture from the melting snow, and as the temperature dropped, the leather froze into an unyielding, cast-like shape. The frozen boots severely pinched his feet, restricting the natural movement of his muscles and cutting off the vital circulation of warm blood to his toes. Silas's feet became cold, numb blocks, and every step he took through the drifts felt like walking on broken glass. He was forced to expend immense physical energy just to drag his heavy, rigid body through his daily chores, his muscles straining against the stiffened leather and frozen wool. His body was wasting precious calories, just trying to overcome the resistance of his own clothing, leaving him physically exhausted and deeply chilled before the midday sun had even risen. He began to realize that his expensive imported gear was actually working against him, turning into a heavy, frozen burden that trapped cold moisture against his skin instead of protecting him. Silas sat on his cot in the evenings, his feet aching with a deep, throbbing pain as circulation slowly returned, his toes white and numb from the day's freeze. He looked at his frozen boots, standing rigid by the door, realizing with a growing sense of dread that he could not continue this struggle through the deep winter months. His clothing had become a physical weight that drained his strength and compromised his safety, leaving him vulnerable to the very elements he had claimed to dominate. He felt a quiet, desperate frustration, realizing that his civilized material progress provided him with gear that was completely unsuited to the reality of a plains winter. Silas wrapped himself in his damp wool blankets, his body shivering as the cold draft from the floorboards found its way through his bedding, his mind locked in a silent, exhausting battle against his own stiffening defenses. The morning of the third major snowstorm brought Aona back to the trading post, his quiet presence appearing like a shadow in the falling white. The Assiniboine elder stepped through the doorway, his eyes taking in Silas Vance's stiffened, frozen wool coats drying uselessly by the hearth, and Silas's obvious, painful, limp. Aona did not say a word, but he reached into his deerskin pack and pulled out a soft, light-colored shirt made of smoked buckskin, placing it gently on the rough wooden table. Silas looked at the thin leather garment with a deep, instinctive skepticism, his mind unable to accept that such a lightweight piece of animal skin could offer any real warmth compared to his heavy wool. He believed that the thin buckskin would let the sub-zero wind cut straight through to his bones, and that Aona's gift was merely a well-meaning but primitive gesture of goodwill. Aona, however, quietly smoothed the soft leather with his hand, encouraging Silas to feel the material's texture and observe its remarkable flexibility. What Silas did not understand was the sophisticated organic chemistry hidden inside that soft, smoked hide. The Assiniboine had carefully treated the raw deerskin with natural oils and animal tissues, softening the collagen fibers that gave the skin its rigid structure. The real transformation, however, had happened during the hours of smoking, where the hide was suspended above a slow-burning, oxygen-deprived punkwood fire. The wood smoke penetrated deep into the collagen fibers, where aldehydes and phenols chemically bound to the proteins, cross-linking them and creating a permanent, water-resistant barrier. This chemical cross-linking meant that even if the buckskin became completely saturated with wet snow, it would not harden, shrink, or lose its shape as it dried. It would remain completely flexible, soft, and comfortable, continuing to protect the body in the harshest conditions. Silas, his body aching from the cold and his feet throbbing with pain, finally decided to swallow his pride and pull the smoked buckskin shirt over his flannel layers. The moment the soft leather settled against his chest, Silas felt a wave of confusion. The buckskin did not feel cold or rigid like his wool, but immediately began to warm against his skin. It blocked the freezing drafts from the floorboards completely, acting as an airtight shield, yet it allowed the vapor pressure from his skin to push his sweat outward through its microscopic pores. Silas's skin stayed dry and warm, the buckskin regulating his body heat. Instead of trapping cold condensation against his chest, he stood up, amazed to find that he could move his arms and shoulders with complete freedom, the light leather conforming perfectly to his movements, without any resistance. He looked at Aona, his mind struggling to reconcile the thin, simple appearance of the shirt with the immediate, profound comfort it provided. Silas realized that this garment was performing far better than his expensive, imported wool, and his body was finally retaining the heat his small fire produced. He felt a quiet, unsettling shift in his understanding of the wilderness, realizing that Aona's people possessed a material technology that was light years ahead of his own heavy, frozen shield. The throbbing pain in Silas Vance's toes had turned into a dull, terrifying numbness by the middle of December, a clear warning that his rigid leather boots were slowly freezing his feet. Aona returned to the cabin on a morning when the wind was running hard out of the north, and without a word, he set down a pair of soft, seamless deer-hide moccasins on the cot. He then reached into his pack and pulled out a large handful of dry wild ryegrass and soft bison down, indicating that Silas should stuff the materials inside the moccasins before putting them on. Silas looked at the soft, thin moccasins with a deep sense of worry, believing that stepping onto the frozen ground in nothing but soft leather would instantly freeze his feet. He had always believed that rigid, heavy leather soles were the only way to protect the feet from the rocks and ice of the frontier, and that moccasins were merely summer footwear. Aona, however, quietly guided Silas's hand to feel the interior of the soft deer hide, showing him how the natural construction allowed the foot to flex and move without any, quote, restriction. What Silas did not understand was the physiological and insulation science behind this simple footwear system. Heavy, rigid European riding boots forced the foot to remain static, compressing the blood vessels and restricting the natural movement of the muscles that pumped warm blood to the toes. Soft moccasins, however, allowed the foot to bend and flex naturally with every step, acting as a muscular pump that continuously forced warm blood to the extremities. The insulation was not in the leather itself, but in the dry, wild ryegrass and bison down stuffed inside. The wild ryegrass contained hollow shafts that trapped high R-value dead air pockets, creating an exceptionally efficient thermal barrier against the frozen ground. As Silas walked through his chores, his feet naturally sweated, but the dry grass absorbed the moisture via capillary action, keeping his skin dry and warm. At the end of the day, Silas did not have to huddle near the fire to dry his boots. He simply pulled the damp grass out of his moccasins, threw it away, and stuffed them with a fresh handful of dry ryegrass. This solved a moisture management problem that continues to challenge modern winter footwear, preventing ice from ever forming inside his boots. Silas pulled the moccasins on, stuffed them with the dry grass, and stepped onto the frozen dirt floor of his cabin, expecting to feel an instant, freezing chill. Instead, he felt a wave of comfortable, gentle warmth spread through his feet as his toes flexed and his circulation returned with a sudden, tingling rush. He walked outside into the snow, amazed to find that he could feel the ground beneath his feet, without any cold penetrating the soft deer hide. His feet stayed warm and dry throughout the entire morning, the moccasins acting as a living, breathing extension of his body. Silas stood in the drifts, looking down at his feet in the soft leather, his mind locked in a silent, humbling realization. He had spent years believing his heavy, rigid boots the only protection against the winter, yet this simple combination of deer hide and wild grass was keeping his feet warmer than his expensive boots ever had. He felt a deep, quiet respect for the organized, elegant science of the people he had once dismissed as primitive, realizing that their survival was built on a deep understanding of the human body and the materials of the land. The real storm finally arrived on the 9th of January, 1080 832, a low-pressure system dropping out of Canada that locked the entire upper Missouri Territory in a white, suffocating wall. The temperature plummeted to a terrifying 45 below zero within hours, and the northwest wind rose to a sustained 50 miles per hour, turning the falling snow into horizontal knives that scoured the prairie. Inside his stout pine cabin, Silas Vance's survival system failed, completely and catastrophically. The immense wind pressure found every single microscopic gap in his clay chinking, forcing freezing air into the room at high done velocity. His massive stone fireplace, which he had fed with his largest logs, began backdrafting violently as the howling wind hit the chimney from an angle that reversed the draft. Thick, black soot and suffocating smoke poured into the small cabin, filling the room in minutes and forcing Silas to his knees as his eyes burned and his lungs gasped for air. He was caught in a lethal trap. Staying inside meant suffocating in the dark smoke, while stepping outside meant facing a sub-zero blizzard that could freeze a man to death in minutes. Desperate and choking, Silas dragged himself to the door, pulled it open against the wind, and stumbled out into the blinding white chaos of the storm, his survival instincts completely broken. The wind hit him like a physical blow, instantly knocking him off his feet and spinning him into the deep drifts where all sense of direction vanished. He could not see his hand before his face, the screaming wind carrying away his breath and instantly freezing the moisture in his eyes. Silas struggled to his feet, his mind clouding with the early stages of hypothermia, his limbs moving with a slow, heavy numbness as the 45 below zero cold began to shut down his core. He realized with a sudden, cold panic that he was going to die in the snow, just yards from his cabin, his stout walls and massive hearth unable to save his life. But as he prepared to collapse into the drift, a strong, heavy hand gripped his shoulder, pulling him upward, with an unyielding force that Silas could not resist. It was Aona, who had navigated the whiteout, with the instinct of a hunter who knew every rise, coulee of the Missouri plains. Without a word, Aona lashed Silas to his own brong, waist with a length of thick buffalo hide rope, guiding his stumbling, half-conscious body through the screaming wind toward the safety of the Assiniboine winter camp. Silas could not feel his limbs, his mind locked in a gray, quiet haze, his body moving only because Aona's hand was pulling him forward through the white wall. When they finally broke through the heavy drifts and stepped into the sheltered coulee where the camp stood, Silas collapsed into the snow, his body shivering violently as the storm raged over. Aona dragged Izakloter, him through the narrow entrance of a large tipi, pulling him out of the wind and into a space that felt instantly, unbelievably calm. The transition from the screaming whiteout of the Missouri plains into the interior of Aona's tipi was so sudden it felt to Silas Vance like stepping into a different world. He lay on the thick buffalo robes, his body shivering violently from the 45 below zero cold, but his eyes opened in amazement at the profound calm of the space. Outside, the 50-mile-per-hour wind was slamming against the coulee with enough force to tear shingles off his trading post, yet inside the teepee, the air was still and quiet. Silas looked up at the curved conical walls of the shelter, watching the hide cover flex slightly under the wind's impact, but showing no signs of strain or instability. What Silas was experiencing was a masterpiece of aerodynamic and thermal engineering designed to work with the forces of the plains rather than trying to block them. The conical shape of the tipi offered a low physical profile that forced the physical profile high-velocity winds to deflect around and over the structure, creating a localized low-pressure zone at the top. This low-pressure zone acted as a natural vacuum, pulling the interior air and smoke upward and out through the adjustable smoke flaps, without any backdraft. Inside, a secondary hide liner was suspended from the poles, creating a continuous 10-inch air gap between the living area and the cold outer cover. This air gap functioned as a highly efficient thermal barrier, trapping still air that insulated the interior from the sub-zero temperatures outside. Cold air was drawn into the teepee beneath outer cover, warmed slightly as it moved through the air gap, and fed the small, central fire from below, preventing any drafts from ever touching the occupants. The warm air generated by the hearth rose naturally to the peak, circulating gently along the curved walls to create an even, comfortable temperature throughout the space. Silas felt the radiant warmth on his skin, his shivering slowly subsiding as his body temperature began to stabilize in the draftless environment. He looked at the soft hide walls and the simple lodgepole poles, realizing with a sudden, humbling clarity that this portable tent was performing far better than his clay-packed log cabin. He had spent months bragging about his stout walls and permanent foundation, yet his cabin had turned into a smoking, freezing trap within hours of the storm's arrival. This simple cone of Dashley skin and timber was managing the wind and heat with a sophisticated grace that his civilized architecture could not even approximate. Silas closed his eyes. Listening to the wind howl uselessly against the hide cover, his mind locked in, a silent, profound realization that Aona's people had mastered the science of shelter long before his own people had ever crossed the river. The fire that Aona built in the center of the tipi was so small that Silas Vance initially felt a wave of deep, instinctive worry as he watched the older hunter arrange the kindling. The entire hearth was no larger than a dinner plate, a tiny circle of dry willow twigs and split cottonwood that flickered with a quiet, modest flame. Silas, accustomed to the roaring, log-consuming blazes of his cabin's stone hearth, believed that this tiny fire would be completely unable to fight the 45 below zero cold raging outside. He expected the freezing air to quickly overwhelm the small warmth and turn the freezing air tipi into an icy cave before the night had even begun. Aona, however, quietly ignored Silas's anxious looks, carefully feeding the small fire with only two split pieces of wood at a time, keeping the flame low, steady, and clean. What Silas did not understand was the physical danger of large fires inside a shelter and the elegant efficiency of the small hearth system. A massive fire inside an enclosed space created an intense convective draft, drawing in huge volumes of cold air through every gap and creating freezing drafts that made the room colder overall. It consumed wood at an unsustainable rate, roasted one side of the body, while freezing the other, and sent most of its thermal energy straight up the flue. Aona's small, controlled fire, however, heated the air slowly and evenly, creating a gentle convection loop that circulated warmth along the curved walls without creating drafts. The real innovation appeared when Aona pulled 3 large, dense granite stones from the fire's edge, where they had been slowly absorbing thermal energy for hours. He wrapped the heated stones in thick buffalo hide and placed them carefully at Silas's feet in his Berkri bedding, acting as a slow-release thermal battery. Granite has an exceptional heat capacity, storing immense energy within its dense molecular structure, releasing it at a slow, constant rate of roughly 2 degrees per hour. Long after the tiny fire died down to coals, the heated stones continued to emit a gentle, radiant warmth that kept Silas's feet and core temperature stable. Through the sub-zero night, Silas lay on his cot, feeling the heat from the stones warm his blood, his feet comfortable and his chest dry in the still, draftless air of the teepee. He realized that this tiny fire, which burned through less wood in a day than his cabin fireplace consumed in an hour, was keeping him warmer and more comfortable than his massive logs ever had. The stones were doing the work that his woodpile had failed to accomplish, storing the energy of the fire and releasing it exactly where his body needed it. Silas looked at the fire in Lee's glowing coals in the center, the warmth radiating evenly from the stone batteries, his mind locked in a silent, humbling realization. He had spent his life believing that more fire was the only way to fight winter, yet this organized, elegant use of mass and geometry was keeping him alive in a 45 below zero blizzard with only a handful of twigs. The physical cold was only half the battle that Silas Vance was fighting. His body, exhausted from the blizzard and shivering, was rapidly running out of the grace metabolic fuel required to keep his internal organs functioning. Silas lay on the buffalo robes, his stomach aching with a deep, empty hunger as he chewed on a piece of cold, salty pork he had carried from his cabin. The salt pork was tough and dry, and as Silas ate it, he felt his mouth dry and his thirst increase, his body expending precious energy just to digest the lean, salty protein. What Silas did not understand was the biological fallacy of his Eastern diet in extreme cold. Digesting lean protein actually required his body to expend precious metabolic energy, wasting calories just to break down the tough fibers. At 45 below zero, his body needed fat, a highly concentrated, slow-release source of calories that could fuel his internal furnace without causing dehydration or digestive strain. Aona noticed Silas struggling with the tough pork, and reaching into his winter stores, he handed the young trader a small, compressed block of pemmican. Silas looked at the dark, dense mixture with a deep sense of suspicion, his mind revolting at the idea of eating a cold paste made of dried bison meat, rendered fat, and crushed chokeberries. He believed that the greasy mixture would make him sick, and that his salt pork was a far more civilized and nutritious food for a working man. Aona, however, quietly broke off a small piece of the pemmican and chewed it slowly, encouraging Silas to try the concentrated fuel. Silas, too weak to argue, took a bite of the pemmican, surprised to find that it did not taste greasy, but rich, slightly sweet, and immediately satisfying. What Silas was consuming was one of the most chemically efficient and nutritionally dense survival foods ever developed by humanity. 1 pound of pemmican contained over 3,000 calories of highly digestible energy, with the rendered bison fat acting as a slow-release fuel that metabolized steadily over 8 hours. It provided Silas's body with the exact lipids required to run his metabolic furnace, warming his blood from the inside out and keeping his core temperature stable without any digestive strain. Within an hour of eating the small block, Silas felt a wave of comfortable, physical warmth spread through his chest and limbs, his shivering stopping completely as his metabolism revived. His body was finally generating its own heat, the pemmican fueling his inner hearth far more efficiently than his salt pork ever could. Silas looked at the small block of pemmican in his hand, realizing that Aona's people had solved the problem of metabolic fuel with a food that was light, portable, and virtually indestructible. He felt a deep, quiet respect for the organized, elegant biology of the Assiniboine, realizing that their winter survival was built on a complete understanding of the human body and the resources of the plains. The blizzard finally began to break on the morning of the 12th of January, the howling wind dropping to a gentle whistle, and the sun rising into a sky so crystalline blue it looked like glass. Silas Vance opened his eyes, his body warm, dry, and completely rested under the buffalo robes, the heated stones at his feet still emitting a gentle, comforting warmth. He sat up, looking around. The quiet interior of the teepee, where Aona was quietly preparing his morning pack, and felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion wash over him. The pride that had defined Silas's life for years, the confidence in his stout log walls, his massive stone hearth, his imported wool coats, and his rigid leather boots had been entirely and completely shattered by the storm. He realized with a deep, humbling clarity that his civilized technologies had actually been the very things that had nearly killed him. trapping him in a freezing, smoking cabin and locking his feet in frozen leather. Aona's primitive ways, which Silas had viewed with such patronizing pity, had been the organized, elegant science that had saved his life, keeping him warm and dry in a 45 below zero blizzard. He looked at Aona, who was quietly securing his moccasins, and felt a profound sense of justice and gratitude that went far beyond simple thankfulness. Silas realized that he had spent his life believing his culture had conquered nature, yet Aona's people had accomplished something far more difficult and beautiful. They had understood it. They had designed clothing that worked with the body's moisture, shelters that worked with the winds, aerodynamics, fires that conserved the forest's resources, and food that fueled the metabolic furnace. It was not a primitive struggle for existence, but a highly sophisticated, structured way of life that respected the laws of the land and the limits of the human body. Silas stood up, his limbs moving with a light, effortless freedom in the smoked buckskin shirt and soft moccasins, his feet completely warm and healthy. He met Aona's quiet, dark eyes, and in that silent, moment, a shared look of mutual humanity and respected wisdom passed between them. There was no need for spoken apologies or dramatic speeches. The thermometer reading of Silas's own warm body and the dry, comfortable interior of the tipi were proof enough of the truth. Silas Vance had entered the Fance File Assiniboine camp as an arrogant trader who believed his civilized power made him superior to the wilderness. He was leaving it as a humble student who realized he had everything to learn from the people he had once dismissed. He felt a deep, quiet inspiration, a desire to understand the land the way Aona's people did, and to live with a humility that respected the natural systems of the buried plains. Silas Vance did not return to his log cabin to rebuild his old life when the spring thaw finally cleared the upper Missouri Valley. Instead, he dedicated himself to a completely different path. He spent the rest of his years on the frontier living in a simple, elegant tipi, wearing smoked buckskin that let his skin breathe, and walking the prairie in soft moccasins stuffed with wild grass. He had learned the hard lesson that nature does not reward pride or bulk, but rather punishes those who ignore its rules and rewards those who understand them. Silas became a respected bridge between the incoming settlers and the indigenous peoples, using his position to quietly teach other traders the life-saving science of the plains. He showed them how to smoke hides, to cross-link the collagen fibers, how to build tipi liners to manage the airflow, how to stack stone batteries to store the fire's heat, and how to make pemmican to fuel the metabolic furnace. He helped save dozens of lives during Frommokan, the periodic Arctic blasts that swept down from Canada, his quiet instruction turning proud, freezing strangers into humble, warm survivors. Silas never claimed to have invented any of these techniques, always directing those he taught to Aona and his people, ensuring that the true credit and respect for this sophisticated science remained where it belonged. He watched with a quiet satisfaction as the old-timers and greenhorns alike stopped laughing at the primitive gear and began adopting the soft moccasins and small fires, their survival proving the truth of the indigenous ways. Silas Vance lived to be 72 years old, his body healthy, his limbs flexible, and his mind at peace. A man who had traded his false shield of pride for the true wisdom of the wilderness. The historical truth is that the greatest winter survival secret in North American history had nothing to do with staying warm. It had everything to do with staying dry, regulating heat, and understanding the physical systems of the human body, and the land. Long before modern outdoor gear companies began marketing high-tech breathable fabrics and insulated boots, the indigenous peoples of this continent had already perfected a comprehensive, coordinated system of winter survival that exceeded the performance of any European technology. They transformed survival from a desperate brute force struggle into an elegant, structured way of life, leaving a legacy of scientific wisdom that remains as relevant today as it was in the winter of 1831. When we strip away our complex machines and expensive fuels, we find that the laws of physics do not change, and the natural systems of our world continue to reward those who listen and punish those who do not. At our channel, we are dedicated to uncovering these forgotten skills, hidden technologies, and remarkable historical truths that allowed our ancestors to thrive where others could not. If this story of Silas and Aona changed how you think about traditional knowledge and the science of the past, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Join us on our next journey as we continue to explore the deepest origins of human ingenuity, and leave a comment below, sharing what lost wisdom you want us to investigate next. Stay warm, stay humble, and thank you for watching.